Well met, everyone. I am Rich the Lich, and today I want to talk about a bit of a contrast to the previous video where I talked about my iconic creatures. Now, one of the main things that you may have noticed in determining which creatures are iconic are what sort of threat they pose to the group. How lethal are they? What is their challenge? In contrast to that, I want to talk about kobolds, where we're looking at the lesser things, the lesser minions, the mooks in 4th edition, the little creatures that are often just sort of throwaways, things that don't seem to have a lot of depth and layers to them. Now, I'm renaming these kobolds, and in just a moment here, I'm going to put up on screen a little stat card that I did, where I did sort of a create a monster in D&D Beyond. And I'm going to call these the TP Kobolds. So TPK, TP Kobolds, right? Now, a big inspiration for this is there is a document out there, a PDF, I believe, called Tucker's Kobolds. And the idea is, I've seen this done with goblins and lesser creatures as well. The idea is that you can take something that is seemingly trivial, very minor in threat rating, in challenge rating, low CR stuff, and you can ramp it up based on environmental issues, based on some various new traits, or just simply how the DM plays the monster tactically. And you can create an immensely lethal situation for your players. Tucker's Kobolds, as I said, is a PDF, I think, where a player that was in the military or something like that was playing in a D&D game once with Tucker. I don't know if that's his real name, but Tucker is the DM. And this goes as far back as, I think, late 80s or something like this. So this has been around for 30 plus years. And it's kind of spread through the internet now, where people are kind of talking about, hey, my PCs are real advanced and it's late game and they're in the last tier, right? So levels 14, 15 plus. And I just don't know how to challenge them anymore. And this Tucker's Kobolds PDF came out, and in reading it, it talks about how the player was talking about how his DM was just so brutally lethal and just an absolute asshole with his kobolds that the kobolds became the most feared creatures. They became the things that the PCs feared the most. And I've always liked that type of thing, because you're not now confined to just the CRs of a monster and that simple relationship between what level are the PCs and what level is the monster. And there's a point where what happens when your PCs are slaying dragons and they're killing liches and a mind flayer colony is just a minor setback. You can certainly play with, and I've done this on previous videos with my Fun Fight series, you can certainly play with environmental things, but just really think through. And the point of this video is just to show you some stuff that I laid out here. I'm going to put a map up on screen, and you're going to also find a description or a PDF download of this map in the description. So you can download it, bring it to your table, and run what I call my TP Kobolds in your game. And it just is meant to illustrate to you how you can take something that would otherwise be a throwaway, the complete opposite to the monsters that I talked about in the previous iconic video, and you can make some lowly, throwaway, previously disregarded and disrespected monsters and make them become a memorable encounter for your group. So first, let's pop up on screen the actual kobold stat card that I made. So here we have the TP Kobold. It is the same in most regards. It's exactly as the regular kobold. So notice his CR is 1/8. Each DM is going to have to wrangle in how much EXP you want to award for this, or if you're using the milestone system, how difficult you want to make this thing, right? But I would definitely skew it up a little bit because the encounter is more difficult. But don't go too far. Don't just start taking, I've talked about this before, don't just start tagging on all sorts of different traits and legendary actions and immunities and all this other stuff, because now you're changing the mechanics of the kobold and it's no longer a kobold. If it's a kobold with 17 levels of barbarian, it's not really a kobold anymore. It's a barbarian at that point. So try and keep the essence and the flavor of what the kobolds are, but you start to maybe layer some things on top of it that can kind of make sense thematically and how kobolds are, and it starts to really bring a layer of just value and depth to all of the monsters in your book. So kind of think through this, and hopefully this is something that you can straight up, as I said, download that map and use these guys at your table. But if nothing else, be inspired to spice up your encounters a little more. So we have the same armor class, we have the same hit points. Notice he's only 5. Basically, any hit against this guy, AE is going to wipe these guys out. Speed of 30 feet, we're not giving him Spider-Man tactics and flying and all this other stuff. It's just a regular kobold in that regard. All the stats are exactly as the kobold. Same as senses, what languages it speaks, and as I said, the CR here is kept the same. Pack tactics, that's the big thing I'm working with here. Look through, when you're looking at the lesser creatures and the things that are sort of throwaways, see if there's some redeeming quality about that creature. Something that might be something you can springboard off of to create some interesting bits. And Pack Tactics is an insanely powerful ability, and its advantage is huge in and of itself. So if you can take advantage of that, no pun intended there, use it in any way you can. So I kept the Pack Tactics exactly as written. It's one of the traits in the monster manual that monsters will have. Kobolds have it. They're known and notorious for that. So that's another thing. Something that is familiar to the monster. It becomes something that the players can work through and say, guys, if they outnumber us, remember, they get advantage, so on and so forth. So Pack Tactics is left the same, and I'll show you how we take advantage of that. I have a new ability called, which will make sense when you see the map, called Bogajo. Bogajo is, I've been playing a troll in World of Warcraft, and I've been in that sort of Bwonsamdi, sort of vibe and accent and essence. Okay, so let's talk about Bogajo. As I said, you'll see him on the map, or you'll see the indication of it on the map. Bogajo is basically the kobolds have taken over a part of a dungeon where there's a torture. Once was a torture chamber. And the kobolds aren't using it for anything torturous. They're not that sinister, horribly evil in that regard. They're just more mischievous than anything else. But they've taken over this area, and they found these scrawlings on the floor. And they believe it is some ancient kobold god. But by being in that area long enough, they've been able to sort of manifest something from that and take advantage of sort of invoking the power from this runic symbol on the floor of this torture chamber, which was there way before the kobolds. Just the kobolds made up this story in their head. And I mean, look at their intelligence. Yeah, they're intelligent enough to have some good tactics, but they're not savvy enough to, really discern the true nature of arcane magic and marks and sigils and whatnot. So Bogajo is just the essence of this spirit. And they can basically summon it, and I'll kind of go through it when we talk about the map itself. As reading it here, the kobold can call upon the spirit of Bogajo to appear within 5 feet of any enemy that's no more than 60 feet from the kobold. It's important to note that it is not a magical ability. It can't be counterspelled when the kobold's trying to do this. The kobold can use, on their turns, a bonus action to basically Bogajo and call the spirit of Bogajo over to an area, right? To a point, so that the spirit appears within 5 feet of an enemy. Notice, Pack Tactics says the kobold has advantage on an attack roll against a creature if at least one of the kobold's allies is within 5 feet of the creature that it's attacking. The Bogajo spirit, that's the whole point of it. It just allows a kobold, in case the PCs were savvy enough to separate the kobolds or kind of isolate one, the kobold can still call the spirit of Bogajo in order to enable it to have Pack Tactics. It's still a kobold. It's still only attacking with a +4 to hit with a 1d4 +2 dagger. But it's allowing Pack Tactics to happen. The spirit distracts and is a nuisance, but it does not deal any damage, and it can't take any actions of its own. The presence of the spirit just simply allows the use of the Pack Tactics trait during its turn. Once the Bogajo spirit is called, a Bogajo charge is used. You, as a DM, need to decide how many charges you want to have available for the entire room encounter. So not per kobold. What I would do is I would have a little index card and write little Bogajo on top and put 10 boxes. And anytime any kobold summons the spirit of Bogajo, I mark it off. So the kobolds are going to have 10 uses of this spirit, where sort of they're taking the story they made up and the magic from the sigil, but they didn't create this. They're not some sort of religious group of kobolds. There isn't some shaman kobold within. they're just using the energy from that 10 times, and then after that, they might still yell Bogajo and use their bonus action, but nothing happens. So you decide how many charges you want. Use of this trait and the Bogajo spirit itself, as I said, is not a summon or a spell. Therefore, once the spirit pops up, you can't dispel it as a reaction, because the spirit goes away at the end of that turn. It's just as a bonus action, the kobold can use Bogajo, and then during its actions, it can use the dagger or the sling attack to be able to make that attack with advantage, because now the target, the PC, is susceptible to pack tactics, right? So, and then, like I said, as a reaction, you're not able to dispel it, and you can't stop the kobold from doing it. It's not a spell or anything like that. As far as actions, the first one at least, the dagger is identical. It's same thing, melee weapon attack, +4 to hit, only 5-foot reach, not a big threat there because it doesn't deal a lot of damage. But instead of just regular sling, which is what the kobolds had, I gave the kobolds here super sling. Okay? And all it is the same thing. It's a ranged weapon attack. The only thing I changed is a normal sling, I believe, has a range of 30, 120. Here, I gave them a range of 60. So within 59 feet or less, I'm rolling straight up, which means with pack tactics, I'm getting advantage. Beyond that, they're going to now roll at disadvantage, and I've shortened the max range. It's almost as though they have, when you used to make slings as a kid with tire inner tubes? They just have some really strong rubber bands. But the reason why I did that, you'll see when we get to the map, okay? Is I wanted to give them a little longer range to take it a little more advantage of range combat. And then there it is, of course. One of their actions, of course, is since they don't have anything else to spend their bonus actions on, they should be able to use that bonus action to trigger the Bogajo trait. But again, they're limited based on how many charges you want to give them, okay? So next up, let me pull up the map, and let's kind of talk through what this is. So if you were to download it and use it as a PDF, you'll have some fun with it. So here we go. Here's the map, right? Now, what are we looking at? We're looking at the Kobold Torture Warrens. Like I said, the kobolds have taken over various parts of the dungeon, and the PCs come in from the entrance point that you can see on the left there, and they navigate their way in, and they come into this area that they can clearly tell was once a torture chamber. There's some implements of it. There's something hanging from the ceiling, a big, massive thing. I mean, if you look at these squares, what are we looking at? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. We're looking at over 100 feet. It's a pretty large area, especially for small folk like kobolds. There is this thing hanging. Now, what are we looking at? Over the center of the room, the bulk of the room, and this is sort of the tactical aspect that the kobolds are going to take advantage of to make them a little more lethal. Remember those things that are... Sometimes you'll see in a torture chamber, you'll see this thing that's kind of... I don't know what it is. There's like a gate up above hanging by chains, and there's spikes on it, and that or it just falls. It's maybe a trap or something like that. But also, what was inspiring it is, the things that you can hang your cookware on, like pots and pans. So here's something, for example, those things that you hang your pots and pans from, that was sort of the inspiration from it. Now, what I did, though, is on the map, I created a really large version of it, and you can see it's that big giant square that's in the middle. And underneath that, so that's at normal height, okay? And what I mean is it's way attached up to the ceiling. And the PCs can tell it's kind of tilted a little bit. Like, it doesn't look overly stable. There's some chains up there that are holding this platform up. There are no longer any spikes underneath it, so it's not an obvious trap in that regard. But there's something going on with that. And you'll notice that if we break through and work our way through the room, if I was to simply read on the little box there, 1 square in this room equals 5 feet, so that gives you some scale. There's always going to be between 4d6 and 8d6 kobolds here. So to take advantage of pack tactics without even thinking of the new Bogajo thing, you need a large number of kobolds. They're a small CR. You need to have overwhelming numbers with them, right? So you decide how many you want to have depending on how large your PC or your group is and what they're, if they're level 1, you may be 46 might be more than enough of a threat. Also, every kobold has 1 flask of Alchemist Fire, just to give them another thing to do and throw, which now possibly causes that constant fire damage every turn, right? Just simple Alchemist Fire as worded in the player's handbook. As a bonus action, as I said, a kobold can call upon the spirits of Bogajo, which enables pack tactics if they didn't otherwise get it from other kobolds being in the area. And then there's a tripwire which will set off the dropped ceiling effect, creating a small space to fight. Kobolds won't leave that space once it falls. That is taking advantage of the sort of ingenious, clever, mischievous trap nature of kobolds. As written in the monster manual, they're just very trap savvy, and they take advantage of things like that. So one thing they've done is they've set up this tripwire, which you can see going across, top to bottom on the map. Once the PCs enter in, to the left, there's just sort of some old weapons. Yes, I know the scale is wrong, but you want to kind of indicate those things on a map because it just helps both you and the players, quickly illustrate what's in that corner. Yes, they're not going to fill up an entire 5-foot square. That's a hell of a lot of weapons, but you can just simply indicate, that there's weapons and weapon racks and all sorts of weird stuff over there in the corner. As I said, the kobolds came into here. They've made some of this their home and established their base here, but there's some existing things that the kobolds didn't set up this torture chamber. They just inhabited what was once a torture chamber in an ancient dungeon. All the way down at the bottom, you see that I've got these labels. This one's called board. All that is there's just wooden tables there and some stools centered around it where the kobolds sit down and just play games or do whatever they do. Notice the bulk of everything is underneath that square area where I indicated there's sort of that grating, like I showed you, kind of like what you would hang your cookware from. But it's massive, right? I mean, we're looking at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, it's like 90 feet by 90 feet square, right? It's huge. Underneath it, you've got a little area that I labeled as fire and shit. So it literally is just random crap of wood and just random things that little, shifty kobolds have gathered up, and they sometimes burn that stuff. And that's where if it's getting cold, they'll set fire to the stuff in that area. You can tell there's a little fire pit there. Underneath that, down below, and these are areas where they're not like separate rooms. They're just sort of indicated and outlined to show you where they are. These are all just things that the kobolds have built up little sections. Again, there's no corridors or doors separating them. They're not rooms. They're just little sections that exist underneath this big, giant, overhanging, falling ceiling platform trap thing. There's the kobold pantry. There's basically just large, barrels or cauldrons just filled with random kobold foods. It smells weird. Over to the right, you see this area called research. You don't have to give this guy new stats. He can be a regular kobold, but there's some sort of 2 or 3 kobold alchemists that there's this long tunnel of random leaky liquid that's coming from this big fountain in the wall, right? Like almost think of a cathedral element. Whatever was there, there's just this dais with this pedestaled sink, if you will. And from that, he's channeled this water. You don't know what's going on with that, but notice there's nothing that I have statted with that. There's nothing I'm indicating as that does X, Y, and Z. But by indicating it, it immediately brings some interest to the back half of the room because now the PCs need to think through, is there something important about that? The only thing this does is it just gives you a little bit of flavor and story as to why all these kobolds have flasks of alchemist fire on them. There's these couple of kobolds that have been doing research over in that area, these alchemist kobolds, that have just been messing around with the stuff from there, and it's a very flammable liquid that they've channeled off of that pedestal sink against the eastern wall. If we're looking at north, south, east, west, right? The eastern wall has this pedestal sink, and they've kind of dug a little valley, a little channel that brings its, that funnels its way into this little pool. And from that, they create this flammable liquid. That the only thing that's there for is mechanically is that's how all the kobolds have alchemist fire. You notice just above that, there's a little section called gamble. That's just where there's some actual good games of poker that go down right there, right? Just keeping some things fun. Up above that is just a bunch of random planks of wood, sacks, cloth, various things that the kobolds have found throughout different parts of the dungeon, and they've created sort of a bedding area. Again, if you're rolling, 8d6 and you've got upwards of 30, 40 kobolds here, they all sleep in that area. And then you notice there's this scrawling on the ground of just weird symbols I made, more geometric shapes. And I call that section the Bogojo section. The kobolds found this scrawling there. It was already there. They've now kind of chiseled and dug into it and messed around. That's the noise they make. Digging into it to do whatever they do to it. But now they just believe that they belong here, and this is sort of one of their headquartered areas of their room because the spirit of Bogojo is here and present. And that is another thing similar to the Alchemist area of, do the PCs need to interact with that to stop or to maybe use up some of the charges that the kobolds have when they go Bogajo and they create this spirit? Maybe there's nothing there, but it just gives you some flavor that when this encounter's done and the PCs win, maybe there's some story arc and some adventure hook there that the PCs can investigate this further. Maybe if they feel like they have to go through further parts of the dungeon and go to other areas, we don't want to run into this Bogajo thing again. So if we see another symbol like that elsewhere, and so on and so forth, it just gives you fuel for the DM. And even as I made it, I don't know where I want to go with it, but it's providing a bit of story as to why the kobolds have been able to sort of manipulate that and create some sort of magical vibe from it. So that's what it is. Now, the tripwire, I just simply looked in the DMG. I found an actual collapsing ceiling effect, so you can use those same DCs as far as how you disable it. There's a tripwire that is really difficult to see, but the kobolds know it. If maybe the PCs had a stealther that was able to kind of look and check the room and linger for a while without the kobolds seeing them, they would see that the kobolds always lift their legs up or they crawl underneath. The point of this is the tripwire causes that whole cooking station area, that whole thing to collapse down to really low level, like 3 feet in height. And what it does is it now makes the kobolds stay back underneath that square the whole time. And that's why I created the sling with a longer range. So now the kobolds have range combat that they can shoot from there. But when the PCs fight, the ceiling isn't going to fall and do any damage like a normal collapsed ceiling would. What it does is it just creates most of this room as a confined space. And now melee combatants are now having to... Spells are fine, range weapons are fine, but melee combatants that are engaging the kobolds in there that are meanwhile throwing 60-foot range slings at them in the room. And you have to have a reason why the PCs stay in the room. There has to be something here they need that you want them to not... Sure, if they want to save themselves, they can leave, but there has to be a reason why the PCs want to clear out the kobolds here and investigate underneath this platform that's now collapsed. But what it does is you can now simply say that all melee combatants, that medium size or larger, which is all your PCs, especially your Dragonborns and your Goliaths, they all have disadvantage when they attack because they're attacking underneath this massive overhanging grid platform. And that's what the tripwire does, is it sinks it down. And you'll notice that's why the kobolds have set up underneath that. They know that they have sort of a little cavernous, when you read up the details on the kobolds, oftentimes they'll fight in small corridors and tunnels and take advantage of their small size. So that's a lot to kind of digest, I know. But that's just the exciting thing I came up with of how to create sort of some new kobolds and put a little bit of focus and emphasis and make your little mini guys just as iconic as the Beholders and the Mind Flayers and the Ancient Red Dragons. I believe this is something that can be a really memorable encounter that might really challenge and possibly TP Kobold your group. That's all I have for you folks. Thanks everyone for watching. As I said, look in the description. You can download this map if you want to use it as a PDF. That's all I have. Take care.